Roscoe Keene had spent 30 years avoiding exactly this kind of trouble, and then trouble walked right into the Dusty Spur Saloon on a Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1882 and sat itself down across from him without so much as a how do you do. He had been sitting at his usual corner table in Caldwell, Kansas. The table with the cracked leg he had personally wedged a folded piece of leather under back in the spring of 1878, nursing a glass of cold water because Roscoe Keene did not drink spirits on weekdays, and that was one of approximately 47 personal rules he had established for himself over the course of 3 decades of purposeful, deliberate, deeply satisfying bachelorhood. He was 30 years old to the month. He owned a cattle ranch 2 miles east of town that he had built with his own hands starting at the age of 17, and he had 5 good horses, a reliable dog named Patch, 63 head of cattle, and not a single complicated human entanglement to his name. He was precisely as happy as a man could reasonably expect to be. And then Abigail Shepherd sat down. She did not ask. She did not hover or wait or catch his eye for permission. She simply appeared, a woman with dark chestnut hair pinned up beneath a travel-worn bonnet, a dress that had once been a deep green but had faded to something more honest from long use, and a canvas satchel hanging from her shoulder that clinked faintly when she moved. She pulled out the chair across from him, set her satchel on the table with a decisive thunk, and sat down like she had reserved that seat a month in advance. Roscoe stared at her. She looked up at him with eyes the exact color of the Kansas sky in October. A particular shade of gray-blue that came after the heat of summer had finally broken, and said, without apparent embarrassment, "I am sorry to impose. Every other chair in this establishment appears to be occupied, and I have been on a stagecoach for 11 hours, and I am not willing to stand." Roscoe looked around the saloon. It was, in fact, fairly crowded for a Tuesday afternoon. He looked back at her. "It is a free country," he said. "That depends enormously on who you are and where you are standing," she said, and then she opened her satchel and pulled out a small leather-bound journal and a stub of pencil and began writing in it as though he had ceased to exist. He watched her for a moment. She had a small smudge of something, ink, maybe, or coal dust from the stagecoach on the left side of her jaw, and her traveling dress, though worn, was clean and neatly pressed despite the evident hardship of her journey. Her handwriting, from what little he could see of it upside down, was extremely neat and moved across the page with startling speed. "Roscoe Keene," he said, because his mother had raised him to introduce himself, and those instincts apparently persisted even when a person invaded your corner table. "Abigail Shepherd," she said, without looking up from the journal. "I am a schoolteacher. I have just arrived from St. Louis. I have been hired by the Caldwell School Board to replace Mr. Hankins, who I understand retired on account of his nerves. His nerves and a rather spectacular incident involving a firecracker and the mayor's horse," Roscoe said. She looked up then, and the corner of her mouth did something that was not quite a smile but was in the vicinity of one. "I have not yet been told that part. Consider yourself warned about the mayor's horse. He holds a grudge." "The mayor, the horse." She did look at him properly then, and something shifted in her expression, a small recalibration, like she was updating an internal ledger. "Are you a local man? Born about 60 miles east of here?" "Been in Caldwell since I was 17. "And what do you do, Mr. Keene?" "Ranching, cattle mostly, some horses." She nodded and looked back at her journal. "Then you will know who I should speak to about lodging. The school board representative who wrote to me indicated there was a boarding house but did not see fit to include an address. Mrs. Clara Finch on Merchant Street, 2 blocks north, 1 block east. Tell her Roscoe sent you. She will give you the clean room." She looked at him again with more attention this time. "There is more than 1 room. 3. One of them has a window that does not close properly and lets in the moths in summer. One has a floorboard that sounds like a dying cat when you step on it at night. The third one is perfectly fine. And how do you know all this? My ranch hand Danny Carr boarded there for 2 years before he got married. He complained professionally about both the moth window and the dying cat floorboard. Abigail Shepherd wrote something in her journal. He suspected she was writing down the directions and possibly something about moths and floorboards, because she struck him as the kind of woman who wrote down useful information rather than feelings. "Thank you, Mr. Keene," she said, and there was something genuine in it, unornamented by social performance. She closed the journal, tucked it into her satchel, and stood. "I will let you have your table back. You were not inconveniencing me," he said, and was somewhat surprised to find he meant it. She gave him that almost smile again, gathered her satchel, and walked out of the saloon into the bright afternoon. Roscoe watched the door settle close behind her. He sat there for another 10 minutes, drinking his water and not thinking about October-colored eyes, and then he went home to his ranch and fed his horses and told himself that was the end of that. He was wrong about that, of course. He was wrong in a way that would redirect the entire course of his life, though he would not understand this for some weeks yet. Caldwell in the summer of 1882 was a cattle town in its prime, situated on the Kansas-Oklahoma border at the southern end of the Kishom Trail, and it was one of the roughest, most energetic, most utterly alive places on the American plains. Longhorn cattle moved through it in great rivers. Cowboys from Texas, dusty and trail-hardened and loud, filled the saloons on the weekends. The railway depot hummed at all hours. There was a newspaper, 2 churches, a doctor's office, 4 saloons, a hardware store, a dry goods emporium, a barbershop, and Mrs. Finch's boarding house, and on the eastern edge of town, a schoolhouse that had been somewhat the worse for wear since the firecracker incident. Roscoe knew every corner of the town and every person in it, more or less. He had been part of the fabric of Caldwell long enough that people greeted him by first name on the street, that the bartender at the Dusty Spur kept his usual table clear until 2 in the afternoon, and that nobody had attempted to set him up with their daughter or their sister or their cousin in at least 3 years, because the effort had proven so comprehensively unrewarding that the community had collectively agreed to leave Roscoe Keene to his bachelor contentment. He was respected, he was liked, and he was entirely alone by design. He saw Abigail Shepherd again 4 days later at the dry goods store on a Saturday morning, and she was engaged in a quiet but intensely determined argument with Floyd Patterson, the store owner, about the price of chalk. 12 cents a box, Floyd was saying, with the defensive posture of a man who had not expected to be challenged. In St. Louis, a box of chalk of this identical size is available for 8 cents, Abigail said, in a tone of perfect reasonableness that somehow made it worse. "I am purchasing 14 boxes, Mr. Patterson, which represents a significant volume of business. I am asking you to consider whether 12 cents per box is truly your best offering." Floyd looked uncomfortable. Floyd was not accustomed to being negotiated with in his own store, particularly not on a Saturday when there were witnesses. "I could do 11, he said, as though the words cost him something. 10, said Abigail, and she smiled at him with complete sweetness. Floyd looked at the ceiling. 10.5. 10, and I will buy my ink and my paper from you as well rather than ordering it from the catalog. Floyd capitulated. He had no real choice. Roscoe, who had been standing 3 feet away ostensibly examining a display of rope, watched the whole negotiation with quiet amazement and felt something stir in his chest that he initially misidentified as indigestion. "Miss Shepherd," he said when Floyd went to wrap her purchases. She turned, and her expression did the same recalibration it had done in the saloon, like she was quickly filing him back under the correct category. "Mr. Keene, good morning." "Good morning." "I see you found Mrs. Finch." "I did. The room is excellent, the floorboard is exactly as advertised, and Mrs. Finch makes the best biscuits I have eaten since my grandmother's kitchen." "She does," he agreed. "How are you finding Caldwell?" "Loud," she said, without particular distress, "and considerably more interesting than I was led to believe. I visited the schoolhouse yesterday. It requires some attention." The firecracker took out part of the east wall. I noticed. I have already written to the school board requesting materials for repair. I also found in the supply closet 17 years of accumulated lesson plans by 3 previous teachers, 2 birds' nests, and a live armadillo. Roscoe blinked. An armadillo. I relocated it courteously to the field behind the building. It did not seem pleased, but it went. She accepted her wrapped packages from Floyd. "Are you attending the town meeting Monday evening, Mr. Keene?" "I attend most of them, yes." "Good. I intend to raise the matter of the school wall, and I suspect I will need someone who can vouch for the timeline of the damage and the reasonable cost of repair. Would you be willing?" He should have said he would think about it. He said yes immediately. "Thank you," she said, and then she carried her chalk and her ink and her paper out into the bright Kansas morning, and Roscoe stood in the dry goods store holding a coil of rope. He had not needed to buy and thought about October skies for the second time in 4 days. The town meeting was held in the Caldwell courthouse, a squat wooden building that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and the ambitious aspirations of civic life on the frontier. By 1882, Caldwell had developed enough of a settled population that town meetings were genuine affairs, with agenda items printed on a single sheet and distributed by the mayor's wife, who had strong opinions about organization. Mayor Aldous Cridge presided with the particular energy of a man who enjoyed presiding. He was a decent enough administrator, but had a tendency to allow small matters to expand into large discussions, which was why town meetings in Caldwell occasionally ran past midnight. Abigail Shepard waded through agenda items regarding the condition of the main road, a dispute about the eastern grazing boundary involving 3 separate ranchers, and a lengthy discussion about whether the town should invest in a second water pump. She sat in the 3rd row, her journal open on her knee, taking notes with that rapid, precise handwriting. Roscoe sat 2 rows behind her and found himself watching the back of her neck, which struck him as an absurd thing to notice. When Mayor Cridge called the matter of the schoolhouse, Abigail stood. She was, as it turned out, a completely extraordinary public speaker. Not theatrical, she did not raise her voice or perform. She simply presented the facts of the schoolhouse's condition with such clarity and quiet insistence that the assembled citizens of Caldwell found themselves persuaded before they had entirely noticed they were being persuaded. She had brought a list of the necessary materials with estimated costs. She had brought a sketch of the damaged east wall. She had a proposed timeline for repair that was reasonable and specific. When someone in the back row muttered that perhaps the school could wait another season, Roscoe heard himself stand. "Miss Shepard's got children scheduled to return in 6 weeks," he said. "The east wall has a gap you can throw a cat through. We would not leave any other building in this town in that condition over winter." He sat back down. Abigail turned and looked at him over her shoulder. He could not entirely read her expression, but it was not unfriendly. The school board agreed to fund the repairs. After the meeting dispersed, he found her on the courthouse steps, writing something in her journal by the light of a lantern someone had left burning by the door. "Thank you," she said, without looking up. The cat analogy was effective. It was true. Truth is most useful when it is also memorable. She closed the journal. The night was warm and thick with cricket song, and the lantern threw a soft amber light across her face. "You have been in this town a long time, Mr. Keene. People listen to you. Some of them. More than some. I watched the room when you spoke. The cattle ranchers deferred to you. Even Mayor Cridge seemed to settle when you said your piece. Cridge and I have an understanding. I don't tell him how to run the town, and he doesn't tell me how to run my ranch." She smiled at that, a real smile this time, fuller than the previous almost smiles, and it did something remarkable to her face, made it incandescent in a way that had nothing to do with the lantern. "That is a sensible arrangement. I think I shall need to develop similar arrangements if I am going to stay here." "Do you intend to stay?" The question hung in the warm air between them. She looked at the dark street, at the golden squares of light in the windows of the buildings around the square. "I intend to give it a proper chance," she said finally. "I have given up a great deal to come here. I should like it to be worth something." He wanted to ask what she had given up. He did not, because it was too personal a question for a courthouse step on a Monday evening after a town meeting, and Roscoe Keene was, among his many other qualities, a man who understood the proper timing of questions. "It is worth something," he said instead. "Caldwell is a real place with real people. It is hard, but it is honest." She looked at him for a moment with those October eyes. "That is perhaps the most useful description of a place I have ever heard." He walked her to Merchant Street, because the evening was dark and Caldwell could be rough on weekends, and he was not willing to let a woman walk alone when he could prevent it. She did not protest his company. They walked largely in silence, which he found comfortable rather than awkward, and which surprised him. At Mrs. Finch's gate she turned to him. "Good night, Mr. Keene. Good night, Miss Shepherd." He walked home along the dark road to his ranch, and Patch the dog met him at the gate and fell into step beside him, and Roscoe told Patch the entire story, because talking to a dog was one of the privileges of 30 years of bachelorhood that he had always particularly enjoyed. Patch listened with appropriate gravity. "She is a schoolteacher from St. Louis," Roscoe said to Patch. "She negotiated Floyd Patterson down to 10 cents a box on chalk. She removed an armadillo from a supply closet. She got the school board to fund repairs in one meeting." Patch said nothing in the way of dogs. "She sat down at my table without asking," Roscoe said, and that was the part that still made something vibrate in his chest, some frequency he had not heard in 30 years of careful solitude. "She just sat right down." He slept poorly for the first time in years. He blamed the heat. September arrived, and with it the opening of school. The repaired east wall of the schoolhouse went up in 3 days of communal work, with Roscoe contributing both labor and lumber from his property. He told himself this was civic duty and nothing more, and he almost believed it until he caught himself taking extra care with the window framing on the east side, because he had noticed Abigail Shepherd sat her youngest students near that wall, and he wanted the window to fit properly against the wind. Danny Carr, his ranch hand, noticed Roscoe taking extra care with the window framing. "That is a very precisely installed window," Danny observed, from somewhere behind Roscoe's left shoulder. "All windows should be precisely installed," Roscoe said. Said Danny, who had been married for 2 years and had arrived at that particular level of marital wisdom that allowed him to say almost nothing and communicate a great deal. The school opened on a Monday in early September with 22 children enrolled, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Roscoe knew this because it was the topic of considerable conversation in town, and because he happened to be at the hardware store when the Becker family came in to buy new boots for their twin boys who were starting school, and Mrs. Becker told him everything in great detail, including the fact that Miss Shepherd had already assigned reading for the first week, and that the Becker twins were not entirely certain how they felt about that. He did not see Abigail for nearly a week after school started, because she was establishing her classroom and her routines with the dedicated intensity of someone who approaches her work as a calling rather than an employment. When he finally encountered her, it was at the Saturday market in the town square, where local farmers and ranchers laid out produce and goods in the early autumn sunshine. She was examining a row of apples at the Miller family's stand with an expression of serious concentration, as though the apples might be concealing something. He stopped. "Apple emergency?" he asked. She did not startle, which he noticed. She simply turned and smiled. "I am looking for the best ones for stewing. The children have been promised apple cake if they complete their geography unit before the end of the month. Miller's big yellow ones stew the best. The red ones look prettier, but they go to mush." She immediately moved toward the yellow apples. "You are an extremely practical person, Mr. Keene. Ranching inclines a person that way. So does teaching." She selected 6 large yellow apples, turning each one to check for bruising with the same thoroughness she'd applied to her chalk negotiation. "How are your cattle?" he blinked. "My cattle? You mentioned 63 head at our first meeting. I was wondering if the number held." She had remembered the number. 61 now. "Sold 2 last week, but I have 4 calves expected in the spring, so the count should come back up." "Do you enjoy it?" she asked, paying Mrs. Miller for her apples. Ranching. Nobody had asked him that in a very long time, if ever. People asked how the ranching was going, meaning financially. They did not usually ask if he enjoyed it. "Yes," he said, and the honesty of it surprised him in his own mouth. "There is something in it, the size of the land, the rhythm of it. You know what needs doing and you do it. The cattle need water and grass. The horses need exercise and care. In the spring there are calves, and in the fall there is the drive, and in the winter you keep everything alive, and in the summer you fix everything that needs fixing. It is straightforward in the way that most human things are not." She was looking at him with those serious October eyes, and an expression he was beginning to learn, a slight tilt of her head, a quality of genuine attention that he found unsettling, because he was not accustomed to being genuinely listened to. "That is," she said quietly, "a beautiful answer." He felt the heat rise in his face and was profoundly grateful for his beard, which he had always maintained primarily for warmth, but was now additionally useful as a means of concealing embarrassment. "It is just ranching," he said gruffly. "The best things usually get described as just something," she said. They walked a few steps together through the market, not by plan but simply because they were both moving in the same direction, and it felt natural, which was itself alarming. "How are the children?" he asked. "Wonderful and maddening in equal measure, which I believe is the honest experience of children everywhere." She shifted her bag of apples to her other arm. 3 of them cannot read at all, which Mr. Hankins apparently chose not to address. "I have started them separately in the mornings before the others arrive. You come in early, every day. The school day officially begins at 8. I arrive at 7. That is not required of you." "No," she agreed. "But those 3 children deserve to catch up. Tommy Reeves is 9 years old and has been sitting in that classroom for 2 years, and no one has taught him his letters. It is entirely unacceptable." Her voice had gone quiet on the last sentence, but with a force behind it that was not anger exactly but something adjacent to it, a deep and personal indignation. Roscoe looked at her and thought that she was not just a good schoolteacher. She was the kind of schoolteacher that Tommy Reeves would remember when he was 40 years old. "His family is on a small homestead north of town," Roscoe said. "His father does his best but works long hours. The boy probably doesn't get much help at home." "I know. Mrs. Reeves told me when she enrolled him, which is exactly why it matters that he gets it at school." She stopped at the edge of the market, near the old oak tree that stood at the corner of the square. The morning light was soft through the remaining leaves. "I am going to teach Tommy Reeves to read if I have to stay in that classroom until dark every day." Roscoe believed her completely. He could not have said exactly why, except that she had the quality of a person who meant the things she said. "If you need materials," he said, "books or slates or the like, the school board can be approached again. I can back you up the same way I did before." She looked at him steadily. "Why are you so willing to help with the school, Mr. Keene?" The honest answer would have been complicated and would have involved acknowledging things he was not ready to acknowledge. So he said what was also true. "I never had a good schooling. My teacher in the county school where I grew up was old and tired and did not much care. I can read well enough, but there are things I had to teach myself, and it would have been easier if someone had taken the time when I was 9. So I believe in it." Something in her expression softened. "Then we are allies," she said. "Allies," he agreed and put out his hand. She shook it, a firm, businesslike handshake, her small hand grip surprising in its strength. And when she let go, he felt the absence of her hand the way you feel the absence of warmth when you step out of the sun. He rode home thinking about exactly nothing, and also entirely about one thing. Autumn deepened into something golden and sharp-edged and beautiful over the Kansas plains. The cattle drives wound down for the season. The cowboys from Texas moved back south. Caldwell grew quieter, which was a relative thing, and the mornings came up cold and brilliant and smelling of grass and wood smoke. Roscoe found reasons to be in town more often than his ranch strictly required. He told himself this was because October was a good time for town business. The hardware store, the feed merchant, conversations with neighboring ranchers about winter readiness, and this was true enough that he could maintain the fiction for approximately 3 weeks. He saw Abigail often, because she was a visible and active figure in the town by now, the kind of person who was involved in things. She was at the church social, organizing a book collection for the school library. She was at the courthouse steps debating with Mayor Cridge about the town's budget for education, not with hostility, but with a persistence that wore away at Cridge's, resistance the way water wears at stone. She was at the dry goods store and the market and walking home from school in the late afternoon with a stack of papers she had been grading. He did not always speak to her, but he was aware of her the way you are aware of weather, an atmospheric condition that affects everything without necessarily requiring your direct attention. When he did speak to her, which became progressively more frequent, the conversations ranged with increasing ease. She had opinions about the cattle industry that were informed and sometimes inconveniently accurate, because she had read about it rather than living it and saw things he had stopped noticing because they were too familiar. She had opinions about the treatment of the native people whose lands this had been, and she stated those opinions plainly, without performance, because she believed injustice should be named even when naming it changed nothing immediately. He agreed with her on that, more than he had admitted to most people in his life, and telling her so felt like setting down something heavy he had been carrying. She asked him about the Kisham Trail, about the cattle drives he'd participated in as a young man before he'd established his own ranch. He found himself describing the trail in more detail than he had spoken about it in years, the dust and the size and the strange brotherhood of a cattle drive, men sleeping on the ground under enormous skies, the violence of a stampede and the quietude of a plains evening when everything was finally still. "You miss it sometimes," she said, one October afternoon when they were walking along the road east of town, which they had somehow fallen into the habit of doing on Sunday afternoons. "Sometimes," he admitted, "the permanence of the ranch is a better life, but the trail was," he searched for the word. "Alive," she offered. "Yes, exactly that." She was looking at the horizon, at the tremendous flat prairie stretching out under a pale sky with clouds building in the northwest, the kind of clouds that meant weather was coming. Her bonnet was back off her head, hanging by its ribbon, and the wind was pulling at her hair. She looked entirely at home in the landscape, which surprised him because St. Louis was not the open plains. "Have you always loved the outdoors?" he asked. "My father was a naturalist," she said. "He catalogued plants and insects. We spent every summer in the field somewhere, Missouri, Indiana, once even into Tennessee. I learned to read the land before I learned to read a book almost." A pause. "He died when I was 16, fever. I'm sorry. He was a kind man and a wonderful father. I am grateful for the time I had with him." She said it without self-pity, with the honest grief of someone who has made peace with loss but not erased it. "My mother remarried a year later, a banker in St. Louis. A perfectly decent man who did not particularly know what to do with a stepdaughter who wanted to teach school and spent her evenings reading instead of developing accomplishments that might attract a suitable husband. So you came to Kansas." She looked at him sidelong with a glimmer of something wry. "So I came to Kansas. Where suitable husbands are, I understand, in rather more rustic supply." He laughed, a real laugh, which startled him slightly because he was not a man who laughed often, and this one came out before he had time to consider it. She seemed pleased in a restrained way, as though she had accomplished something. "You are not seeking one, I take it," he said. "A suitable husband." She was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk work the thermals high above the prairie. "I sought to make my own life." A schoolteacher can do that in a way that most other paths open to women cannot offer. I chose this deliberately. Another pause. Though I will confess that deliberate choices can be revisited when circumstances prove different from expectation. He did not press that thought. He was not ready to press it, and she had not offered it as an invitation. The wind picked up from the northwest, and with it came the first real cold of the season, a clean bite that smelled of distance. She turned her face into it with closed eyes for a moment, the way a person does when they are grateful for a particular sensation. He watched her do that, and he understood that he was in serious trouble, and he was not entirely certain it felt like trouble anymore. The crisis, when it came, arrived in November in the form of a man named Fletcher Dade. Fletcher Dade ran a competing cattle operation 40 miles west, and he had a long-standing disagreement with Roscoe over a shared water access point along the creek that ran between their grazing ranges. The disagreement had been dormant for 2 years, settled by an informal agreement that both men watered on alternating days. But Fletcher Dade had arrived in November with the opinion that the informal agreement no longer suited him, and he expressed this opinion by sending 3 of his men to block Roscoe's cattle from the creek on what was unambiguously Roscoe's day. Roscoe handled it the way he handled most things, directly and without unnecessary drama. He rode out with Danny Carr, confronted Dade's men, and sent them back with a message that the agreement stood or the matter went to the county court in Wichita. There was a tense half-hour of mutual stubbornness, and then Dade's men withdrew. No shots were fired. No one was hurt. The cattle drank. The story, however, was in Caldwell within 24 hours in the way that stories in small towns travel fast and with elaboration. By the time it reached the Dusty Spur, Roscoe had apparently faced down 6 men, and by the time it reached Mrs. Finch's boarding house, it was reportedly 10. Abigail did not believe the 10-man version. She came to his ranch for the first time on a Saturday morning, arriving on a hired horse from the town livery. She rode adequately, he noted, in the upright style of someone taught on a trail rather than for pleasure, and she found him in the yard repairing a saddle. How many men were actually there? She asked, without preamble. He looked up. She was looking at him with an expression that was somewhere between concern and exasperation, and the November sunlight was behind her, and Patch the dog was sitting at her feet with absolute adoration, which was a betrayal Roscoe noted. 3, he said. It was 3 men. It was over in 45 minutes. Nobody discharged a weapon, and I am completely fine. I wanted to establish the facts, she said. They are established. She slid down from the horse, which showed the ease of someone who had done it many times, and Patch pressed his entire body against her leg with pathetic enthusiasm. She reached down and scratched his ears with the efficient affection of someone who likes animals but doesn't perform it. "Can I see the ranch?" she asked. He stared at her. "You came out here to see my ranch. I came out here to establish the facts about the water access dispute, which I have done. I am now asking separately if you would show me your ranch." She met his eyes. "I would like to understand where you live. You have been to my school, it seems fair." He showed her the ranch. He had not thought about it particularly before, what it looked like to an outside eye, what it meant. He had built most of it himself or directed its building, and it bore the marks of his particular mind. Efficient, neat, with a few oddities that revealed the person beneath the practicality. The barn had a small weather vane he had made himself from sheet metal, in the shape of a horse, because he had found the project satisfying one winter evening. The front porch had 3 rocking chairs, which was 2 more than a single man needed, and which he had never been able to explain to himself except that 3 felt right. The kitchen garden, dormant now with November, was bordered by smooth river stones he had collected from the creek over the years, not because it was necessary, but because he found the stones pleasing. She noticed all of it. She said nothing for a while, just walked and looked, and then she said, "You are not as solitary as you present yourself." "What does that mean?" "The 3 rocking chairs," she said. "The weather vane, the stones around the garden. These are things a person does when they expect to share a life with someone, even if they have not consciously admitted it. He opened his mouth and closed it again. "I am not saying it unkindly," she said quickly, and there was something careful in her voice, something that told him she had not meant to say quite that much and was navigating the consequences. "I am only saying this is a house that has room in it, not just in the rooms but in its intention." The word landed somewhere in the center of his chest and stayed there. They stood in the kitchen garden among the dead stalks and the river stones, and the morning was still and cold, and the sky was that deep November blue, and Roscoe Keene looked at Abigail Shepherd and felt 30 years of careful bachelorhood shift beneath him like ground in a small earthquake. "Abigail," he said, and then stopped. She looked at him. "I have not been as good at being alone as I thought," he said, which was the most honest and most difficult thing he had said in possibly 10 years. She was quiet for a moment, a long enough moment that he had time to feel exposed and foolish, and also somehow entirely certain he had said the right thing. "I have been teaching school for 6 years," she said at last, "and I have been alone by design and proud of it, and I came to Kansas to continue being alone by design, and I sat down at your table in the Dusty Spur because there was nowhere else to sit, and I have thought about that entirely too much since then." He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them was the cold morning air and Patch the dog and the river stones and 6 years and 30 years of determined self-sufficiency. "Would you have dinner with me?" he asked, "not in the saloon properly. At a table with a cloth and food cooked by me, because I am a reasonable cook, and I would like to feed you a meal and sit across from you and talk until one of us has to go home." She smiled then, not the almost smile or the quarter smile or even the full-faced smile from the courthouse steps. This was something quieter and more private, the smile of a person who has gotten something they wanted and is still slightly surprised by it. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He cooked her supper that same evening, because there was no reason to wait, and neither of them was the waiting kind. He made beef stew with root vegetables from the kitchen garden stores and cornbread, and he opened a jar of apple preserves that Mrs. Finch had given him the previous autumn, and which he had been saving for an occasion that now appeared to have arrived. She arrived at the correct time because she was punctual, and she brought a small bunch of dried wildflowers from a bunch she'd apparently had in her room, which she set in a jar on the table without explanation. He did not ask for one. They sat across from each other in the kitchen of the ranch house at the table he had built himself 11 years ago, under a lantern that threw warm light across everything, and they talked for 3 hours without running out of things to say. They talked about books. She had read more than he had, but they had several in common, and he had opinions about the ones they shared that surprised her with their depth. They talked about the future of Kansas, about the railway and what it was doing to the cattle trade, about whether Caldwell would still be a cattle town in 10 years or whether it would become something else. They talked about her father and his mother, who had died 2 years ago, and whom he missed with a specific quietness that he had not described to anyone before tonight. At some point, they had moved from the table to the front porch, sitting in 2 of the 3 rocking chairs because the evening had turned clear and cold and brilliant with stars, and the lantern from inside threw a rectangle of light through the window, and the whole world was dark and enormous and full of cricket silence, because this late in autumn even the crickets had quit. "I have never sat on a porch quite like this," she said, meaning something larger than just the porch. "Neither have I," he said, meaning exactly the same large thing. In the rocking chair, she had pulled a shawl around her shoulders against the cold, and a strand of her hair had come down from its pins and curled against her cheek, and she was looking up at the Milky Way with the same absolute attention she gave to everything. And Roscoe Keene felt something final and irrevocable happen in his chest, like a door he had kept carefully shut for 30 years swinging fully, permanently open. He was not frightened of it, which astonished him. He had expected, if this ever came, to be frightened. He had told himself for 30 years that the reason he had no intention of love was that Love made a man vulnerable, and vulnerability was dangerous. And a ranch required strength and steadiness, and he could not afford to be undone by a feeling. He had believed this so thoroughly that he had never questioned it until this moment, sitting in his own rocking chair next to a woman who had negotiated chalk prices down by 2 cents a box and removed an armadillo from a supply closet, and who remembered that he had 63 head of cattle, now 61, with calves expected in spring. He was not frightened. He was, improbably, relieved. "Abigail," he said. She turned her face from the stars. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, which was cold from the night air, and held it in both of his, which were large and were cruffined and warm. She looked down at their hands and then up at his face. "I would very much like to court you," he said. "Properly, with your permission, and with the full understanding that I am 30 years old and have been a bachelor by preference and am somewhat uncertain what I am doing, but that I intend to learn." Her expression was the most complex thing he had ever seen on a human face, a mixture of emotion he could not entirely parse, amusement and tenderness, and something that might have been the same relief he was feeling. "You are doing fine," she said, and squeezed his hand. "Yes, you may court me, Roscoe Keene." He held her cold hand in his warm ones until the cold had fully left it, and they sat under the enormous Kansas sky, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and it was perfect. Courting a woman like Abigail Shepherd, Roscoe discovered, was not a passive enterprise. She did not sit and wait to be impressed. She was interested in everything and willing to go anywhere, and she treated their courtship with the same engaged seriousness she brought to everything else in her life, which he found exhilarating in a way that occasionally caught him off guard. She came to the ranch on Sunday mornings and learned the names of all 5 horses and the particular personalities of each. The bay mare named Sable she declared her immediate favorite, because Sable was opinionated and did not tolerate fools. He taught her to recognize the early signs of illness in cattle, which she absorbed with focused attention, and then wrote notes about in her journal, because she was apparently incapable of learning anything without recording it. He walked her over every acre of his grazing range and showed her the creek that had been at the center of the dispute with Fletcher Dade, and she stood on the bank and said, with the calm certainty of someone who has reached an irrevocable conclusion, "You will have to settle this properly or it will come back. You should consult a lawyer in Wichita." "A lawyer in Wichita is expensive," he said. "Recurrent water disputes are more expensive," she said. He engaged a lawyer in Wichita, and the informal agreement was formalized into a legal document registered with the county court, and Fletcher Dade signed it with visible resentment and no further incident. Abigail was right about most things, which was something Roscoe had known since approximately the first week of their acquaintance, but which became clearer and clearer as the months wore on. In return, she showed him what she was building at the school. By December, Tommy Reeves was reading simple sentences, and he read them out loud to Roscoe one afternoon when Roscoe came to help with a repair to the wood stove. And Tommy read with the solemn pride of a 9-year-old who has found a door that was previously invisible, and Roscoe shook his hand like an adult and said, "That is first-rate work, Tommy," and the boy almost vibrated with happiness. Abigail watched from across the room with an expression of such quiet joy that Roscoe had to look away, or he would have said something embarrassing in front of the children. Christmas came to Caldwell with a moderate snowfall and considerable festivities. The church organized a pageant. Mrs. Finch's boarding house put up a wreath. The Dusty Spur hung bunting that was slightly the wrong shade of red for Christmas, but conveyed the spirit adequately. Roscoe brought Abigail a gift that he had spent 3 weeks selecting and rejected approximately 11 options for: a leather-bound journal with unlined pages, a better quality than anything available at Floyd Patterson's dry goods store, which he had ordered specially from a bookbinder in Wichita, and which had her initials, A.S., stamped in gold on the cover. She held it in her hands and was silent for a long moment, running her fingers over the initials. "This is the finest thing anyone has given me in a very long time," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "It is a practical gift," he said, which was only half true. "You are always saying that," she said. "Practical, useful." As though caring about something means less if it is also useful. He looked at her in the candlelight of the school, which they had to themselves on the Christmas Eve afternoon, just the two of them and the decorations the children had made, and the small pine tree in the corner that Abigail had insisted on bringing in from the woods herself with a borrowed handsaw. "I suppose I do that," he said. "You are allowed to simply want to make me happy," she said, without the excuse of practicality. The plainness of it, the simple giving of permission to feel a simple thing, hit him somewhere profound, the way the simplest truths sometimes do. He reached out and tucked that errant strand of hair, the one that always escaped its pins, back behind her ear, and she went very still. "I want to make you happy," he said. "There is no practical reason for it. It is simply what I want." She turned her face slightly into his hand, just for a moment, like a person turning into warmth, and he understood for the first time in his life what the 3 rocking chairs had always been waiting for. He did not kiss her on Christmas Eve in the schoolhouse. He was not a man who did things impulsively, and he believed some things deserved the right moment rather than simply the first available one. The right moment came on New Year's Eve, which Caldwell celebrated with considerable vigor, including fireworks organized by the mayor that were only moderately successful but enthusiastically received. They stood together at the edge of the town square while the fireworks went up in bursts of red and gold over the dark Kansas plains, and the crowd around them was noisy and joyful, and Abigail was laughing at something he had said, a genuine, whole-body laugh that he would remember for the rest of his life. And he turned to her and said, "Abigail," and she was still laughing when she turned to look at him. And then she saw his expression, and the laughter quieted into something different. He kissed her there under the fireworks, with the smoke of gunpowder and celebration in the air, and she kissed him back with the same purposeful sincerity she brought to everything, and when they broke apart the square was ringing with the sounds of 1883 arriving. "Happy New Year, Roscoe," she said softly. "It is going to be," he said, and meant it in a way that encompassed everything. January in Kansas is a serious month, and it makes serious demands on ranchers. The cold came down from the north with a particular purpose, and Roscoe worked long days keeping his cattle fed, and his horses warm, and his buildings watertight against the wind. He saw Abigail less than he wanted, which was itself a revelation, that he was capable of wanting something more than he was getting, that the satisfaction of his solitary ranch life had a gap in it he had not previously been able to see. He made the ride into town twice a week regardless of weather. Some days he had time only to stop at Mrs. Finch's for 15 minutes, drink a cup of coffee in the parlor while she described her day or her concerns about a particular student, and then ride back. But he made the ride. She noticed that he made the ride. "You don't have to come in bad weather," she told him, the second week of January when he arrived with snow in his beard. "I know," he said. "You will be back in the spring with calves to manage, and you will have less time, not more." "I know that too." She looked at him over her coffee cup with those careful eyes. "Then why?" "Because the 15 minutes are worth the ride," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said quietly to herself more than to him, 30 years a bachelor, as though she found it slightly extraordinary. "That was before you sat down at my table," he said. She looked at him then with an expression of such warmth that he felt it across the distance of the parlor like actual heat. "I sat down at your table because I was tired and there was nowhere else to sit." "I know," he said. "I am very grateful for that specific combination of factors." In February, he asked her father's blessing, which was not possible since her father was dead, and so he wrote instead to her mother in St. Louis, a formal and carefully composed letter in which he described his ranch and his standing in the community and his intentions toward Abigail, and asked for the family's blessing on a formal proposal. He told Abigail he had done this. She stared at him. "You wrote to my mother." It seemed the correct thing to do. My mother is going to be astonished, she said. Is she going to be opposed? Abigail considered. No, she has been worried about me out here alone. She will be relieved. Pause. She is also going to have opinions about the wedding if it comes to that, and she will want to express them by letter at considerable length. I can read at considerable length, he said. She laughed, and then she turned serious with the particular quality of her serious, the clear-eyed kind that meant she was about to say something real. You are asking me to marry you, Roscoe. Not yet, he said. I am asking your mother first. Then I am asking you, properly, with the question stated plainly. You are very formal in your courtship. You are a formal person, he said. You appreciate things done properly. She did not deny it. My mother will write back in 3 weeks, she said. Letters from St. Louis take that long. The letter came back in exactly 3 weeks and 2 days, in a fine envelope with a St. Louis postmark, addressed to Roscoe Keene in a handwriting that was slightly less precise than Abigail's, which suggested the quality of the penmanship was something Abigail had improved on rather than inherited. The letter was gracious and warm, and gave its blessing without reservation, and included 2 full paragraphs of opinions about wedding arrangements, as predicted. On a Sunday in early March, when the first suggestion of warmth was coming back into the Kansas air, and the ranch was beginning to smell like cold earth thawing and new growth just beneath the surface, Roscoe Keene drove his wagon into town to collect Abigail for the Sunday ride that had become their custom. He stopped at the edge of the creek, where the cottonwood trees were just beginning to bud, and the water was clear and running fast from the snowmelt in the north, and he tied the horse and helped her down from the wagon, and he took both her hands and said what he had been working up to saying for 4 months. Abigail Shepherd. I have spent 30 years thinking I was complete as I was, and I was not wrong, I was content, and content is its own honest thing. But content is not the same as full, and I did not know what full felt like until you sat down across from me in the Dusty Spur and told me there was nowhere else to sit and started writing in your journal as though I had ceased to exist. He paused. She was watching him with eyes that had gone bright. You have made my life larger by being in it. I want it to be larger still. I want the 3 rocking chairs to have a reason. I want to build something with you, not just the ranch, but everything, all of it, the long thing. He tightened his grip on her hands. Will you marry me? She stood there in the March morning beside the running creek with the cottonwoods just waking up around them, and her eyes were bright in a way that had moved beyond whatever she had been trying not to show, and she said, Yes, Roscoe. Yes, absolutely, yes. He pulled her into his arms right there on the creek bank, and she pressed her face against his coat, and he felt her laughing quietly, and he held her and felt the whole weight of 30 carefully solitary years transform into something else entirely, not negated, not erased, but completed, like the final part of a structure that finally made sense of all the preparatory work. You are shaking, she said, from against his coat. I am aware of that, he said. She tipped her face up and looked at him with those October eyes full of warmth and humor and that particular quality of attention that still undid him every time. So am I, she said. He kissed her, there on the creek bank, for longer than was strictly necessary for the purposes of confirming an engagement, and the horse watched with the patient indifference of a horse who had seen everything. They were married on the 15th of May, 1883, in the Caldwell church, on a morning of such extravagant loveliness. The sky a deep saturated blue, the prairie grass new and brilliantly green, the air warm and moving gently from the south, that several attendees later said it had seemed arranged by the weather as a personal favor. The whole town came. Roscoe had lived in Caldwell for 13 years, and the community he had built, without particularly meaning to build a community, turned out in its entirety. The mayor was there, and Floyd Patterson from the dry goods store, and Mrs. Miller from the apple stand, and Danny Carr and his wife, and Tommy Reeves and his parents, Tommy sitting in the church with the careful posture of a boy attending his first important event, wearing his best shirt that was only slightly too small. Mrs. Finch came in a hat with 3 large feathers. Half the ranching community of the county appeared. Abigail's mother had come from St. Louis, had made the train journey in 2 days, arriving with 2 trunks and several opinions about flower arrangements that she delivered with the tact of a woman who understood she was a guest in a situation she had not created. She was a tall, fine-boned woman who had clearly been the origin of Abigail's posture if not her eyes, and she looked at Roscoe with the appraising attention of a mother ensuring her daughter was not making a catastrophic mistake, and apparently concluded that she was not. "You have a good face," she told him the evening before the wedding over supper at Mrs. Finch's. It was not precisely a compliment, but it was not one either. "Thank you," Roscoe said. "You are steady," she said. "I can see it." "Abigail needs someone steady. She is remarkable, my daughter, but she throws herself into things with great force, and sometimes the force carries her to places where she needs an anchor." "I understand," he said. "Good," she said, and that, apparently, was that. Abigail came down the church aisle on the arm of the school board chairman, Mr. Hendricks, who had offered because there was no male family member present, and who was slightly overwhelmed by the responsibility and showed it in the rigid angle of his elbow. She wore a dress that was the color of cream, with blue trim at the collar that was precisely the color of October skies. He noticed it immediately and understood that it was not coincidental, and her hair was pinned with small blue flowers, and she was carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself that morning from the prairie, because Abigail Shepherd Keenby was not a woman who needed someone else to pick her flowers. She walked up the aisle and came to stand beside him, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and something in his expression made her smile start small and grow until it was the full incandescent smile from the courthouse steps, but larger than that, more alive. And he thought he had never in 30 years seen anything as beautiful as this woman smiling at him on the morning of their marriage. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Alcott, who had known Roscoe for 10 years and conducted the service with appropriate gravity and genuine warmth. The vows were the traditional ones. When Roscoe said the words "to have and to hold, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health," he said them in the steady, deliberate way he did everything that mattered, and Abigail's hand was steady in his, but her voice, when she spoke her vows, had the slight roughness of someone managing emotion by sheer determination. When Reverend Alcott pronounced them married, Danny Carr whooped from the 3rd pew in a way that was entirely inappropriate for a church and entirely appropriate for the occasion, and Mrs. Finch burst into tears of the joyful variety, and Tommy Reeves sat very straight and clapped very seriously, and Roscoe kissed his wife for the first time as her husband, and Abigail Shepherd, who was now and would always be Abigail Shepherd Keene, because she told him clearly that she would keep both names, kissed him back with the same fearless directness she brought to everything. They celebrated in the square, because the church was not large enough and the weather was too beautiful to waste indoors. Mrs. Finch organized food with the women of the church auxiliary, and there was more of it than 20 weddings could have consumed: venison and beef and ham, and every variety of pie and the apple cake, made with Floyd Patterson's yellow apples and served in honor of the students who had earned it. There was music, a fiddle player and a man with a guitar who were not technically professional but were enthusiastic and largely in the same key, and dancing on the flattened earth of the square, couples moving in the warm May afternoon while the fiddles sang. Roscoe danced with his wife. He was not a great dancer, but he was competent, and she was better than him, which she discovered mid-dance and adapted to immediately, making small adjustments to her own steps that somehow made both of them look better. He noticed this and told her so. "Teaching 22 children of varying abilities simultaneously has given me a certain adaptability," she said, her eyes laughing. "Is that what it is? Also, I simply have better rhythm than you. You are going to be a very honest wife." "You would not respect me if I were any other kind," she said. He pulled her slightly closer in the dance and said, against her hair, No, I would not. They took their wedding supper alone, back at the ranch, at the kitchen table with the cloth on it and a candle burning, and the dried wildflowers from the school she had brought to them in November in a proper glass vase he had bought in Wichita. Through the window, the prairie was golden with late light, and Patch the dog was on the porch making small sounds of contentment. He poured her a glass of the good wine he had purchased from the liquor merchant in Wichita and raised his own glass. "To you," he said. "To us," she corrected. "To us," he agreed, and they drank, and the evening settled around them with the particular peace of a day that has been exactly what it was supposed to be. She moved into the ranch the following morning, with her 2 trunks and her satchel and her collection of books, which turned out to be considerably larger than could comfortably fit in 2 trunks and required an additional trip with the wagon. He cleared 2 shelves in the front room for her books, and then realized 2 shelves were insufficient and cleared 4, and began building another bookshelf on the wall beside the window. "You do not have to build a bookshelf immediately," she said. "You have a lot of books," he said. "I have always had a lot of books." "Then the bookshelf is a practical matter," he said, with intentional gravity, and she threw a copy of a collected essays volume at him, not hard, and he caught it. She planted a spring garden in the kitchen garden among his river stones, with additional flowers along the south-facing fence that she said were for the bees, but which she clearly also simply wanted for the color. She established a system for the household accounts that was significantly more organized than his previous system, which had been approximately, know roughly how much money is in the cash box and spend less than that. She had opinions about everything and shared them plainly and expected his opinions in return, which was the most exhausting and most invigorating element of marriage he had discovered so far. She continued teaching. This had never been in question. She had stated before the wedding that she intended to continue, and the school board had confirmed her position as permanent teacher rather than a term appointment, which Mayor Cridge announced at the April town meeting with the air of a man who had made an excellent decision and intended to receive appropriate credit for it. The summer of 1883 was hot and busy and good in every way that mattered. His ranch prospered. 4 calves were born in the spring, strong and healthy, bringing his herd back to 65 head. He hired a second ranch hand, a young man of 20 named Eli Marsh, who was earnest and capable, and who became quietly devoted to Abigail within the first week because she brought lunch to the ranch hands on Saturdays without being asked, and because she remembered both men's birthdays. Abigail's garden produced brilliantly. The bee flowers along the south fence drew a genuine abundance of pollinators, and she kept notes on the species in her journal, with small, accurate drawings that suggested her father's eye for natural observation had settled thoroughly in her. She had begun teaching the older students natural science alongside reading and mathematics, in a departure from Mr. Hankins's curriculum, and had received approximately 3 letters from parents questioning whether natural science was a necessary subject for frontier children, and approximately 20 from parents whose children had come home energized and curious and begging to know more. She showed Roscoe the letters on a quiet evening, sitting together on the front porch in the rocking chairs, and he read through them in the warm summer evening and looked up and said, "You are changing this town." She looked at him, surprised. "I am teaching school." "The same thing," he said. "The children you are teaching now will be running this place in 20 years. They will be doing it better because of you." She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when something had reached her too fully for immediate speech. Then she said, "You have no idea what it means to me to be believed in that way." "I think you should know it," he said, "in case no one has been saying it clearly enough." She reached across and took his hand the way he had taken hers that November night, and held it, and they sat together in the warm dusk, watching the fireflies rise over the prairie, while the evening star appeared in the west above the dark line of the horizon. In September of that first married year, on a warm evening at the end of summer, Abigail told him quietly over supper that she was expecting a child. He sat very still for a moment, which she watched with visible uncertainty, and then something happened in his face that he could not have described, and which she apparently did not need described because she saw it and a breath went out of her, and she smiled with such relief and joy that he got up from his chair and came around the table and gathered her into his arms right there, gently, because the knowledge of new fragility changes the way you hold things. "A baby," he said, against her hair. "In the spring," she said. "April, I think." He held her for a long time in the warm kitchen, with the supper getting cold on the table and Patch snoring contentedly on the porch outside, and he thought about April, and the sound of the word in connection with the word baby, and felt something he could only identify as the absolute opposite of everything he had believed about himself for 30 years. The spring of 1884 brought, along with the calves and the garden and the returning warmth, a son. He was born on the 7th of April, after a long night and most of a morning, with the capable midwife, Mrs. Powell, in attendance, and Roscoe pacing the kitchen in a state of controlled terror that he had no experience managing. When Mrs. Powell came out to tell him it was a boy and that Abigail was well, he sat down on the kitchen floor, which was undignified, and which he would not have been able to explain except that his legs were no longer accepting instructions. Abigail held the baby with the competent, focused attention she gave to everything important in her life, and she looked up at Roscoe when he finally came into the room, moving carefully, like a man approaching something that might be a dream, and she was pale with exhaustion, and her hair was loose, and her eyes were brilliant. "Come and see your son," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was very small and very red and had dark hair that would probably be dark like Abigail's, and who seemed deeply offended by the world but was enduring it. He put out one finger and the baby's fist closed around it with astonishing grip for something so small. "Hello," Roscoe said to the baby, which was all he could manage. "We had agreed on a name," Abigail said. "James," he said. "James Samuel Keene, Samuel for her father." "James Samuel," she said. "Yes." He looked at his son and at his wife, and at the morning light coming through the window of the ranch house, and he understood with perfect completeness why 30 years of deliberate bachelorhood had never quite felt like enough, and why sitting down across from a woman who sat down at your table without asking had been, as it turned out, the beginning of everything. James Keene grew with the particular speed and determination of a ranch child, outdoor and sun-browned, and endlessly curious about every living thing on the property. Abigail's naturalist father was apparently alive in the boy in the way that certain qualities skip a generation and then arrive with renewed force. He was fascinated by insects, by the creek, by the sky, by the names of things and why they were called what they were called. By the time he was 2, he knew the names of all 5 horses. By 3, he was following his father around the cattle range with serious concentration, learning the work. Roscoe taught him everything slowly and completely, the way he believed things should be taught, with patience and without shortcuts. He found, to his own continued surprise, that he had a great capacity for this, for the slow instruction of a small person, for the repetition required for something to become known, for the particular joy of watching comprehension arrive in a child's face. "You would have been a good teacher," Abigail told him, watching him one afternoon as he showed James for the 4th time how to approach a horse at the shoulder so as not to startle it. "You would be a good rancher," he said. "I already am partially," she said, and it was true. In the summer of 1886 a daughter arrived. She was smaller than James had been, which frightened Roscoe, but Mrs. Powell assured him she was perfectly healthy and simply small, and this proved to be accurate. Clara Elise Keene was small but formidable, and had apparently inherited her mother's disposition toward negotiating from a position of absolute confidence, which became evident before she could speak full sentences. James received his sister with the charitable condescension of an older sibling who has been promised she would be interesting, found her initially disappointing in her infant state, and then gradually fell into genuine fascination as she became ambulatory, and then verbal, and then, somewhere around her second year, clearly the kind of person who was going to challenge every assumption he held. The school thrived. By 1886, enrollment had grown to 31 students, and the school board, under persistent gentle pressure from Abigail, had agreed to fund a second teacher. A young man recently graduated from the Normal College in Topeka, named Marcus Webb, who arrived with excellent qualifications and a certain anxiety about his new posting, and who settled within 2 months because Abigail was an extraordinarily organized person to work alongside, and because the community had grown, through the school, into something invested in its children's education in a way it had not been when she arrived. Tommy Reeves, who was 13 now, was reading at a level 3 years above his age, and had begun helping the younger students in the afternoons, which was Abigail's idea, and which Tommy had accepted with the slightly stunned grace of a boy who had not previously thought of himself as someone who could help anyone. Roscoe saw Tommy at the market one Saturday and asked how school was going, and Tommy said, with the quiet certainty of someone speaking a truth they have only recently arrived at, "Miss Shepherd, Mrs. Keene. She is the best teacher I have ever had. She made me feel like I could do things." Roscoe told Abigail that evening, and she was silent for a moment and then went and put her face against his shoulder, and he held her and said nothing because nothing needed saying. The Fletcher-Dade water dispute rose one more time, in the drought summer of 1887, when the creek ran low and both operations were under pressure. Dade sent a man to Roscoe's ranch this time with a proposition, a financial settlement in which Roscoe would accept a reduced water access in exchange for a payment that was, on its surface, reasonable. Roscoe was inclined to refuse, purely on principle. Abigail read the written proposal Dade's man had left, sat with it for 15 minutes at the kitchen table with her pencil in hand, and then said, "Counterpropose a drought protocol in the formal agreement. If the creek falls below a specified level, both parties reduce access proportionally. That protects both operations fairly, and Dade cannot argue against it without looking unreasonable." He counterproposed. Dade accepted. The lawyer in Wichita updated the document for a fee that was significantly less than the amount Dade had originally offered, and the matter was settled, permanently, on terms that were genuinely fair to both parties. "You were born to negotiate cattle-country disputes," Roscoe told her. "I was born to negotiate chalk prices," she said. "The principal transfers. 1887 was hard in the drought and wonderful in everything else. The ranch survived because Roscoe managed resources with the discipline of a man who had weathered multiple drought years and had planned accordingly. The children were healthy. The horses were fine. The cattle lost some weight in the dry summer but came back in the autumn rains. The school added a small library of 23 books, which Abigail had assembled through a combination of purchase, donation from the community, and one extraordinarily successful letter she had written to a book publisher in Chicago who had donated 15 volumes in response to her description of the school. They sat together on the porch on evenings when the ranch and the school and the children and the horses and the cattle had all been attended to, and the day was finally, deeply done, in the rocking chairs that had always had room for them, with the enormous Kansas sky above the prairie going through its extraordinary repertoire, orange and red and purple at sunset, then the deep indigo of dusk, then the absolute black wilderness of night full of more stars than any city-raised person could have imagined. "I have been thinking," Abigail said, on one such evening in the autumn of 1887, when Clara was 1 and James was 3, and the drought had broken and the grass was green again. "Oh, me," he said, "I have been thinking about the children at the school whose families cannot afford books, not the school books, the school board covers those now, but the reading books, the story books, the ones children take home and read for pleasure." She turned her glass of water in her hands. "I want to establish a lending library. attached to the school but open to the whole community, books that can be borrowed and returned so anyone in Caldwell can read without needing to purchase. He thought about this. He thought about himself at 9 years old, wanting books and not having them. He thought about Tommy Reeves at 9 years old, not knowing his letters. "How much will it cost to start?" he asked. "Less than you are probably thinking," she said. "I have already drafted a letter to the Chicago publisher again, and Mrs. Finch has offered 3 books from her own collection, and Floyd Patterson said he might be persuaded to donate a small amount if I let him put his name on the sign above the door." Floyd Patterson's name above the door of a library is a somewhat improbable sentence, he said. "It is a slightly improbable world," she said. The Caldwell Community Lending Library opened in the spring of 1888, in a corner of the schoolhouse that Roscoe and Eli Marsh had converted with new shelving and proper windows. It had 47 books at opening. The mayor cut a ribbon. Floyd Patterson stood beside the sign that read, in small but visible letters, "Generously supported by Patterson's Dry Goods Emporium," and looked more pleased than he had looked about anything since Abigail negotiated his chalk prices. The community came. Not just the schoolchildren or the ranchers and their wives, the shopkeepers, the young cowboys between drives who had not touched a book in years. Roscoe watched a man he knew named Burrell, a big, quiet cattle drover who had worked the Kisham Trail for 15 years, stand at the shelf for a long time and then carefully take a copy of a novel about the sea, and carry it to the table, and sit down and begin to read it with the concentration of a man who has been hungry for something and has finally found it. He went home that evening and told Abigail about Burrell, and she listened with her chin in her hand and her October eyes serious and warm. "That," she said, "is why." "Yes," he said, "that is why." Years settled on them the way good years do, not by accumulating weight but by deepening, each one richer than the last because they had more to build on. James Keene at 5 was a small version of his father in manner, but had his mother's eyes and her habit of watching things with careful attention before speaking. Clara Keene at 3 was the most verbally confident 3-year-old in the history of Caldwell, a fact confirmed by multiple witnesses, and had a personality that combined the best of both her parents with an additional quality all her own that could only be described as an absolute certainty of her own importance in any room she entered. Roscoe watched his children and felt the particular astonishment that parents feel when they realize they have made something that is better than themselves, not because they are diminished by it, but because the project of passing your best qualities forward and watching them grow into something new is perhaps the most extraordinary thing a human life can include. In the spring of 1889, another child arrived. A second son, smaller and quieter than James had been, with an expression from the first week of life that suggested he was taking notes. They named him William after Roscoe's father, and he grew into a child who was capable of sitting still longer than any child his parents had previously observed, which Abigail said meant he had a contemplative nature and Roscoe said meant he was going to be either a philosopher or a very patient fisherman. He was, by age 2, deeply interested in the books in the front room. Not in reading them, he was too young for that, but in the physical fact of them, in taking them off the shelf and stacking them and arranging them by size and then by color. Abigail watched this with the expression of a woman who has identified a quality and is making a note of it. "Library," she said quietly to Roscoe. "What? William, he will work in a library someday or run one." She watched her small son carefully arrange a stack of books by spine width. "He is already organizing the collection." "He is 2 years old," Roscoe said. "The best ones start early," she said. The decade of the 1880s closed and the 1890s opened, and Caldwell changed the way frontier towns change. Slowly at first and then with increasing speed, as the cattle trade gave way to farming, and the railroad remade the economy, and the open range gave way to fences and farms. It was a change that held both loss and gain, as all true changes do, and Roscoe navigated it by adapting his operation fewer cattle, more horses, which were needed differently in the new agricultural economy. He took on young horses and trained them, which suited his patience and his relationship with animals, and it proved a sustainable business through the changing years. Abigail navigated it by what she had always done, by paying attention and responding with intelligence to what the community actually needed, rather than what it thought it needed. As more farming families arrived with children whose educational needs were different from the cattle town children, she updated her curriculum. She attended conferences in Wichita and once in Topeka, and came back with ideas and energy and notebooks full of new approaches. The school grew. The lending library grew. By 1892, the library had moved to its own small building beside the school, properly constructed, with a sign that no longer mentioned Floyd Patterson because Floyd Patterson had sold his store and retired to his daughter's farm in Iowa. There were harder things in those years, too, because life on the plains did not provide only the good. The drought years were hard on the ranching community. A fever went through Caldwell in the winter of 1891, taking 2 of the older citizens and putting 3 children in bed for weeks, including James, who recovered fully but who left his parents with the terror memory of those weeks that never entirely disappeared. Abigail's mother died in the spring of 1892, peacefully, in her home in St. Louis, and Abigail grieved with the honest, functional grief of someone who has made peace with the inevitability of loss, but is nevertheless reduced by it. Roscoe sat with her through those weeks and let her grieve without trying to fix it, which was the right thing and also not natural to him, but which he had learned because marriage and love teach you things about yourself that you would not otherwise discover. He got better at sitting with things he could not fix. She got better at letting him see when she was struggling rather than managing through it alone. These were not small adjustments. They were the ongoing negotiation of 2 people who had both spent years self-sufficient to a fault, learning the very different skill of constructive dependence, of being the kind of person who can lean and the kind of person who can be leaned on, sometimes simultaneously. "We are both stubborn," she said once, on an evening in the middle of the difficult winter of 1891, when the ranch accounts were tight and the weather was severe and James was still sick and they were both more tired than they had admitted to each other. "Yes," he said. "I thought stubbornness in a marriage was a problem," she said. "I am not sure it is. I think it might be why we manage." "Stubbornness and honesty," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "The combination is somewhat exhausting, but it works." James recovered fully and was back at school and then back on the ranch range with his father by the time the spring came. He was 7 years old and already had an opinion about everything related to horses, and Roscoe allowed the opinions because most of them were not wrong, and because a boy who thinks about horses carefully will take better care of them as a man. In 1893, the summer of the Chicago World's Fair, Abigail took James, who was 9 and becoming deeply interested in science and invention, on the train to Chicago to attend the exposition. She had organized the trip with her characteristic precision, found a colleague in Chicago who could offer lodging, and planned the visit down to the individual exhibits she intended to show him. Roscoe stayed with Clara and William on the ranch and listened on their return to James describe the electrical lighting of the fairgrounds with an expression of pure astonished wonder that Roscoe kept in his memory like a physical thing. "Father," James said, "they had electrical lights everywhere. Not gas. Electrical, and it was bright as day at midnight. And there was a machine, a moving machine, and you could see the future in it, I think." Roscoe looked at Abigail over James's head. She was smiling with the contained warmth of a mother who has given her child a gift he did not know he needed. "What did you think?" Roscoe asked her later that evening. "I thought it was extraordinary," she said, "and I thought, the world is going to change enormously in the next 20 years and our children will live in that change and I want them ready for it." "They are," he said. You are seeing to that." She looked at him across the kitchen table, the table he had built himself, the table where she had written in her journal the first night they ate supper together, the table around which 3 children had eaten approximately 6,000 meals, and she reached across it and took his hand. She said, "we are seeing to that." He turned his hand over and held hers, and the evening light came through the kitchen window, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the children were asleep, and the ranch was still. And Roscoe Keene thought about a corner table in the Dusty Spur Saloon and a Tuesday afternoon in 1882, and a woman who sat down without asking. And he understood with the full knowledge of a man who has lived enough to understand such things that there was no calculation large enough to express what a single moment of unasked-for company could grow into, given time and willingness, and 2 people stubborn enough to do the work of loving each other properly. James Keene went to proper school in Wichita at 14, on the recommendation of one of Abigail's educational colleagues, who had been struck by the boy's aptitude during a visit to the Caldwell school. Roscoe drove him to the train station himself and stood on the platform and felt the particular pride and loss of a father releasing a child into the larger world. And when the train pulled out, he stood there until it was a speck, and then nothing on the horizon. On the way home, he stopped at the Dusty Spur out of habit, out of sentiment, and sat at his corner table, the one with the cracked leg he had wedged leather under in 1878. The leather was still there, still holding. He ordered water as he always had on weekdays, and he sat and thought about everything that had happened from this table, and then he got up and went home to Abigail. She was in the front room grading papers when he came in because the school year did not pause for sentimentality, and she looked up from her work. "Well," she said. "He went," Roscoe said. "Of course he went. He is ready." She set down her pencil. "Are you all right?" "I will be," he said. "I'm proud." "I know," she said. "I just need to be sad for a minute." "That is allowed," she said, and moved to the settee and made room beside her, and he sat down. And she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the front room among the books and the lamp light, and the papers she'd been grading, and the drawings Clara had made and stuck to the walls, and the careful arrangement of volumes on the lower shelf that William was still quietly reorganizing whenever he thought no one was looking. Home, Roscoe thought. This is what home is. Not the land, though he loved the land. Not the ranch, though the ranch was good. Not the security of the cash box or the head count of cattle or the reputation in the town. This. The weight of her shoulder against his. The light in the room. The noise of children somewhere else in the house doing whatever children do when they think you are not watching. By 1897, Caldwell had settled into a different shape than the raw cattle town of 1882. It had a bank now, and 2 doctors, and a proper post office, and the school had its permanent library and a 3rd teacher, and a new coat of paint that the school board had agreed to with only minimal persuasion required, because the school had over the years become a source of genuine community pride. Many of the children Abigail had taught in the early years were adults now running farms, managing businesses, some gone further west or to the cities. But many had stayed, and you could see, in the way they engaged with the world, the particular quality of people who had been genuinely educated, who had been told they could do things and had believed it. Tommy Reeves was 24 and farming his family's land, which he had significantly improved and expanded since his father's time, and was known in the county as an intelligent and forward-thinking agriculturalist. He stopped Roscoe on the road one autumn day and talked to him about soil management for 20 minutes with a command of the subject that made Roscoe think of a 9-year-old boy reading his first sentence out loud in a schoolroom and feel something about the long arc of things. In the summer of 1898, James came home from his schooling in Wichita with a certificate in engineering and a young woman named Margaret, who was from a Kansas City family, and who had the slightly startled look of someone not entirely prepared for the scale of the Keene ranch and the force of Abigail Shepherd Keene's welcome, but who recovered quickly and proved to have a quality of resilience that suggested she would do well. James married Margaret in the Caldwell church in September of 1898, in a ceremony that was smaller and quieter than his parents' wedding, but conducted with the same genuine feeling. Roscoe sat in the front pew with Abigail on his left and Clara on his right and William on Clara's other side, and watched his son stand up in front of the community and begin the work of his own life, and felt such a complicated mixture of joy and awe, and the particular love a parent carries for a child that he could not have spoken if required to. Abigail leaned against his arm just slightly, the way she had in the early years when they were learning how to be beside each other, and he covered her hand with his. "We did well," she said very quietly. "We did," he said. "We did do well." Clara at 12 was already something opinionated and quick and funny, with her mother's precision and her father's practicality wrapped in a personality entirely her own. She had opinions about the cattle operation that were sometimes inconvenient in their accuracy and opinions about the library that were consistently useful, and she had announced at 11 that she intended to be a doctor, which had been met by her parents with complete seriousness and the beginning of inquiry into how such a thing could be accomplished. William at 9 was still quietly reorganizing the library. He had also begun writing stories, notes, observations about the natural world in the tradition of his grandfather he had never met, and which Abigail had shown him through her own father's field journals that she had brought from St. Louis. He was a contained, interior child who would occasionally produce a sentence of such unexpected observation that everyone in the room would stop and look at him, and he would look back with the mild expression of someone who cannot understand what the commotion is about. The ranch went through its rhythms, as ranches do, good years and hard years, and the steady work of maintaining something worth maintaining. The horse training operation had grown into a recognized business, with buyers coming from 3 counties for Roscoe's trained horses, and he had built a proper training ring off the east side of the barn and hired a second trainer in addition to Eli Marsh, who had been with the ranch for 15 years now and was as much a part of it as the buildings. One October morning in 1899, 17 years after a Tuesday afternoon in the Dusty Spur, almost to the month, Roscoe found Abigail in the kitchen garden among her river stones, doing the autumn cleanup before the first frost. He had been meaning to do this for a week, but she had gotten there first, as she often got to things before they were scheduled because efficiency was apparently a compulsion she had given up apologizing for. He stood at the garden gate and watched her for a moment. This woman who had sat down at his table without asking. This woman who had negotiated chalk prices and removed armadillos and built a library and taught Tommy Reeves to read and raised 3 children and helped him understand that solitude and companionship were not opposites, but rather different tools for different stages of a life, and that a man who had believed he was happy alone had simply not yet encountered the person who showed him what happy actually felt like. She was 40 years old. She was more beautiful to him than she had been at 28, because he knew her now, not the surface of her but the depth, the full complexity of a real person lived alongside over 17 years, and the accumulated love of that time sat differently in his chest than the first bright flame of it. It was not less. It was more, the way a deep-running river carries more than a surface creek even though it is less visible. She looked up and saw him at the gate. "Are you going to stand there, or are you going to help?" she said. He opened the gate and came into the garden and picked up the other pair of work gloves she had left on the stone border, because she had known he would come, and he worked beside her in the morning light among the dying summer plants and the enduring river stones, and they talked about James and Margaret, who were expecting their first child in the spring, which would make him and Abigail grandparents, a word that still surprised him, and about Clara's application to a school of medicine that had recently begun admitting women, and about William's essay that had been published in a Wichita newspaper, and about the creek level and the winter preparations, and whether the east barn needed a new roof before spring. They talked about everything and nothing, the way people talk who have been building a shared life long enough that the language of it has become second nature, a fluency in each other that requires no translation. When the garden was done, they stood at the edge of it in the October morning, and the sky was the exact color of October skies, that particular gray-blue that Roscoe had first noticed 17 years ago in the eyes of a woman who sat down at his table without asking, and the prairie ran out to the horizon in every direction, immense and beautiful and entirely, permanently home. "You know what I think about sometimes," he said. "You never say what you are about to say," she said, knowing him. "You say you think about it first, so yes, tell me." "I think about that Tuesday afternoon," he said, "in the Dusty Spur before you came in." She looked at him. "I was sitting there thinking I was exactly where I wanted to be," he said. 30 years old, no complications, the ranch going well, perfectly content. I was so certain I had it right. "And then I sat down," she said. "And then you sat down," he agreed. "Without asking." She smiled, the full smile, the one from the courthouse steps that had grown over 17 years into something she did with her whole face, her whole self, entirely unself-consciously, the smile of a person who is genuinely happy and no longer guards against showing it. "There were no other chairs." "There were also no other chairs in my life," he said, "until you sat down." She looked at him for a moment with those October eyes, and then she put her arms around him there in the kitchen garden among the river stones and the dying summer plants, and he held her with his arms around her back the way he had learned to hold her, not gently because fragile but firmly because real, because she was real and here and his, and he was hers, and the enormous world kept going around them. The horses in the barn, the cattle in the field, the children grown and growing. The town with its library and its school, the creek with its legal document, the sky with its bottomless October blue. He was 47 years old and had been a bachelor for exactly 30 of them, and had been in love for 17, and there was nothing complicated in the accounting. 30 years of building himself into something solid, and then 17 years of that solid thing being part of something larger, and the sum was a life he could not have designed if he had tried, that had arrived instead through the specific miracle of a woman who was tired and saw an empty chair and sat down without asking permission. He kissed her in the kitchen garden in the October morning, as he had kissed her on the courthouse steps and under the New Year fireworks and in the schoolhouse on Christmas Eve and on the creek bank when she said yes, and in the church when Reverend Alcott told him he could, and on approximately 10,000 mornings and evenings since, because it never became ordinary, because the ordinary things done with love become the least ordinary things in the world. Patch the dog had died years ago, and there had been subsequent dogs. Currently a brown and white hound of great enthusiasm named Deputy, who had come with a name already attached that they had not seen fit to change. And Deputy was sitting at the garden gate watching them, with the happy bewilderment of a dog witnessing human behavior that does not require intervention. From inside the house came a sound William, playing something on the old piano Abigail had acquired 3 years ago through means that still remained somewhat unclear to Roscoe, but which had involved several letters and a favorable arrangement with the Wichita music merchant. He played well, William, with the focused patience of everything he did. Clara called something from upstairs, probably asking about something she could not find and which was almost certainly exactly where she had left it. The morning went on. The ranch went on. The life they had built together, from a corner table and a Tuesday afternoon, and the simple fact of nowhere else to sit, went on deep-rooted and spreading, solid as the river stones in the kitchen garden border, alive as the prairie in spring, as enormous and enduring as the Kansas sky in every season. Roscoe Keene had spent 30 years a bachelor and been proud of it, and then Abigail Shepherd had sat down at his table without being asked, and that had been that. And that was everything.